I chose this chapter, or like I guess this book maybe in particular, because like maybe most recently, like in the next like or in the most recent couple months, I've noticed like how wonderful it is, or how useful it is to have these kind of like readily available examples when someone's like, when has socialism ever worked, or like when has this ever worked? And I think it's like really important to go back and study these historical moments whenever the masses, whether they're explicitly like workers or industrial workers, or whether they're explicitly like unionized, but whenever like masses of people were able to affect social developments and like have influence and political power um, in a big way. The beginning of this book talks about something they call revolutionary moments. Um, so yeah, so that's like kind of why I want to do this. Another thing that I like about this chapter a lot is it doesn't like kind of bog us down with like all the different political currents within specific moments. It doesn't go into like this group was like this thing, and this group was this thing, and this group had this thing. But more so, it kind of like takes the whole thing and talks about like when the masses come together, what are they able to achieve, which I think is a really useful thing to study. So I will start with my little talk, and then I will say some other things after that, because apparently I'm the only one who's talking tonight. So yeah, this is about Argentina in 2001. On December 20th, 2001, an evacuation helicopter appeared over the presidential palace in Buenos Aires. In the wake of citizens lying dead in the streets, the elected Argentine president, Fernando de la Rua, was forced to resign, staring down an angry mass of Argentinians chanting, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. The people united will never be defeated. This revolutionary event was not the spontaneous action of a singular moment, nor did it come as the result of a military coup. This event was nothing short of the culmination of months and months of intentional organizing by enormous masses of citizens who had been engaged in the beautiful act of thinking politics without the state and seeing what came out the other end. To begin, we should go back to the early 90s, when the beast of neoliberalism comes knocking in Argentina. There are people far more qualified than me to explain the stranglehold placed on the Argentinian economy in the 90s by the IMF and the World Bank, and international finance organizations. But to take just a quick second on neoliberalism. Firstly, it kind of has nothing to do with modern day liberalism in the United States, and is basically an economic theory developed in a lab to restart backwards economies in the global South. Economic liberalization policies are generally those that limit and lessen the government's intervention in the economy, including but not limited to privatization, which is like the selling of publicly run industries to private companies, deregulation, the removal of regulations, globalization, opening up national economies to international markets, free trade, lowering tariffs on imports, and austerity, defunding public programs like transportation, healthcare, and education, etc., and a reduction of government spending to increase private companies' involvement in the economy and society at large. In Argentina, this plague took the form of the convertibility plan in 1991 that was forced on the people of Argentina as a necessary price to pay in order to stabilize hyperinflation in the economy. All of that is to say that these policies were good in the short term, as far as for economic growth, good for economic growth in the short term, basically facilitating a massive influx of capital to jumpstart or shock the economy back to life. But really, really, really bad for the Argentinian economy in the long term, and turned a country known as the world granary for its massive agricultural exports into a country with unemployment reaching as high as 22%, with 50% of the population living in poverty, and 20% of the population that was homeless. Argentina was basically tanked, not only economically, not only the material base, but also the superstructure dependent on that base. Neoliberal hegemony included all of the ideological deterioration that comes with it. The magical belief that and some of those ideological ideas are that the magical belief that the free market will spirit away all problems, mass consumerism, the belief that more is always better and we have to consume our way out of problems, Modernization of public services pushed this ideology into daily life by reinforcing fierce individualism and pitting workers against one another. The meritocratic bootstrap idea is so popular in America. Consumer overspending and individual career success at the expense of collective solutions. And not to mention capitalist realism, or the idea that, as Margaret Thatcher puts it, that there is no alternative, that capitalism is reality. For 10 long years, capital in its most raw and aggressive form had run rampant through every facet of Argentinian society. What resulted from a period of class war so lopsided was a massive crash of the Argentinian economy that saw the Argentinian peso, lose 3/4 of its value almost overnight. Many would correctly see this as bad for workers. Anyone can see that. But was this a defeat for the working class? The economy was going to crash regardless. There's absolutely nothing that a progressive president or a lesser evil campaign could do about that. The silver lining of this massive devaluation of workers' wages was the ideological clarity that came with it. By the time the economy devalued wages by 30%, there had already been massive movements in motion centered around a popular democratic agenda. The crash signaled a death spiral for neoliberal institutions. The efficacy of private enterprise had its legs cut out from underneath it. The IMF strategies of deregulation were almost unanimously rejected, like anyone agreed to austerity regardless of that. Neoliberal ideology collapsed into a flaming pile of disorder, and the demand for a new post-neoliberal hegemony was born. This crisis in the economics spilled over into the disenchantment and the systemation as well. The politicians that had auctioned off their entire country to the highest bidder responsible for this turmoil. After 5 presidents had been forced to resign in a few months, there was finally a figure who would act in accordance with the popular rebellion that was still raging in the streets. During this period, the entire function of the state was in jeopardy. Everything down to the recycling and collection of trash was subjected to scrutiny from the masses. This massive weakening of the political system was no more than the production of their transferring of power over to the free market and its national financial organizations. The vacuum that was left after the free market was proven bullshit was filled with a rise in liberatory and autonomous ideologies. People imagined anew egalitarian structures of self-governance and beyond. The faith in professional politicians had disintegrated as people understood that the running of society could be in the hands of the people. Contrary to some beliefs that De la Rua, the president, was routed by some Peronist conspiracy are unfounded. The revolutionary moment in Argentina in 2001 was the combined product of a terminal economic and political crisis and a popular rebellion that genuinely emerged from below. These roots would mark out the road for the decade that followed, a decade that saw one key player of capitalism remain intact, the Peronist center. Juan Perón was a figure very similar to FDR, who saved capitalism through populism, smoke and dagger, labor support, and social programs to buy off the industrial working class. Peronism's capacity to maintain its position as the party of order and governability, despite the rampant radicalism, marks the key difference between Argentina and its South American counterparts, like Bolivia, Ecuador, or Venezuela. More exactly, it marks the difference in distance of constituent assemblies in other countries, and the fundamental limits imposed upon the changes in Argentina. The Piqueteros movement, which means like picketing, the Piqueteros movement challenged the revolutionary strategy of a seizure of state power advocated for by the parties of the left. This strict abstention from state intervention and autonomous approach to self-governance was one of the factors which allowed the exact same actors who ushered in neoliberal economic policies to be the only option for getting out of those exact same policies. That would be like the Peronist politicians. This isn't to say that the Trotskyist left had no intervention in the rebellion of 2001. But what was new in this period and represented the dynamic forces at the heart of the protests were the new social movements that emerged with unprecedented strength. The Piqueteros movement, which was taking major steps in the development of self-organization, independent of bureaucratized unions or bourgeois parties. The creation of cooperatives and self-organized production give impetus to autonomous ideological currents based around a strategy of not taking power and going beyond wage labor to the self-reproduction of social life outside of capital. The ideological terrain was as wide as one might expect, with the radical pillar of get rid of them all as the center. The left organizations also joined with the Piqueteros in one way or another, at least from 2000 onwards, once they had overcome, and this was not the case for every left group, once they had overcome the workers' prejudices that made everyone not occupying a direct role in production somehow suspect or less valuable to the movement. The legacy of 2001 are still felt in Argentina today. The 20 plus years has been insufficient to wipe away the imprint the mass mobilizations and highway blockades had on the minds of politicians and people alike. The movement from 2001 has inspired an entire generation of activism that is surprisingly mass-oriented in character compared to other countries, with an extremely high proportion of involvement from everyday people. Truly, 2001 was a year that shifted the political framework in Argentina for years and years to come and fundamentally reoriented the political culture. The general sense of fierce rebelliousness from 2001, never before had the world seen mass highway blockades before, nor a government brought down by a popular rebellion rather than a military coup. A centrality of civil rights, a new vision of how, where, and what role the Argentinian masses would play within international geopolitics, and a fervent revision of the past to highlight the radical character. All of these are parts of the legacy of the mass mobilizations in 2001. Today, Argentina remains a source of pain and unjust political maneuvering. Ultimately, the Argentinian rebellion of 2001 failed to seize state power and failed to instate the dreams of millions. Regardless of this shortcoming, when new crises and conflicts erupts, because we have a necessary assurance that they will, the people will not have to start from scratch, and the next movement in Argentina will be built on the heroic shoulders of the Piqueteros.